In debating the terms at the core of this book are many terms: Judaismos, Judaismus, Yahadut, Yiddishkeit, Judentum, Judaism. Daniel Boyarin starts from what scholars define as a deconstructionist approach concerning our academic categories for describing past but also contemporary othernesses. Such a question was at the core of another book, the book by Carlin Barton and Daniel Boyarin, as well as by Brent Nongby, among others, in his Before Religion, A History of a Modern Concept. And other scholars, for example, Anders Klostergaard Petersen, in a review of this book by Daniel, has recently remarked, I want to quote this statement because it's very interesting and it's very useful for my evaluation. I quote, "I sympathize with the overall argument and the injunction to abandon the term religion in translations of any ancient texts. That said, however, I also have some severe queries with the argument. To be crude, one could argue that the authors are carrying call to new castle. For a scholar in the study of religion, it is an old truth that there can be no term religion in the pre-modern world. This is the basic argument of Max Weber in his seminal Zwischenbetrachtung, and one may add the central contention of Durkheim as well. A century ago, Weber emphasized how the invention of religion presupposed the detraction of the phenomenon from the wider cultural sphere, something dated by Weber to modernity. One could draw a distinction in the ancient world between the sacred and the profane, the latter designating diminishing degrees of sacredness, profanum, but never something categorically secular. I find it striking that this central contention of emerging sociology a century ago has neither been taken into consideration by Barton and Boyarin nor by Nongby. Ultimately, I claim that their argument affirms Weber's and Durkheim's view, but from the perspective of early sociology. It is pouring new wine into old wineskins. End of quotation. I want to emphasize today here that in dealing with the cultural universes of what we call Judaism, it is important, and this is, in my opinion, the most important critical gesture of Daniel's book, to abandon the Christian modern evaluation of the concept of religion. Going further, academic debates about the proper category definition of religion, which always remains a semantic maneuver of redefinition carried out on a Western term. Boyarin's deconstructive gesture is particularly important because it makes patently clear that Judaism was often interpreted in light of Christian and or modern theological, teleological, hegemonic evaluations. Let us be aware of the historic implications of this interpretative operation in the field of Jewish studies, also taking into account that Daniel is an American Jew. So this is very important also about this epistemological approach. With this book, Boyarin continues his explorations in this direction. His main aim here is at demonstrating, I quote, that Judaism as a name that Jews use is just such an ism of modern invention, end of quotation. In Boyarin's eyes, if Judaism is a modern term, it implies that using it to refer to the past is the product of an anachronistic bias in which ancient Jewish form of life and our modern conception of religion are found to be improperly associated. As clearly emerged from these statements, a key concept in Boyarin's deconstructionist journey is that of forms of life. Forms of life. I quote, page 25. In investigating a language, we are investigating a form of life that has no word that means religion, cannot have religion in it, nor can there be a Judaism without a word that refers to it. End of quotation. In the first part of the book, Boyarin develops further Steve Mason's positions against the meaningful usage of the term Judaism in antiquity. More precisely, Boyarin emphasized that there is no Judaism as the name of a religion in antiquity. Discussing, as I've already mentioned, Jonathan Zay Smith's assertion that religion, I quote, is a product of the scholar's study, end of quotation, Boyarin maintains, for example, that for their modern cultural formation, historians have constructed separate realms, called religion and politics, for example. Polarizations of this kind, Boyarin states, basically emerge as inadequate to look into the complex forms of life that are attributable to ancient and medieval Jewish organizations and descriptions concerning a particular world. In discussing the famous passages in 2 Maccabees where the Greek term Judaismos firstly appears, 2:21, 8:1, 14:38, Boyarin maintains that if in the same text, for example 4:13, the presence of Hellenismos functions as, I quote, acting like a Greek and being loyal to the Greek cause, end of quotation, Judaismos would be then seen, I quote, as a natural back-formed opposite to indicate acting loyally to the Jewish way of life and policy, end of quotation, page 43. Boyarin vigorously states that Judaismos, I quote encore, means exactly what it ought to, namely, viewed with one another in the activity, the doing of acts of dedication to the ways of the Judeans and the partisanship for their cause against their oppressors, the barbarians, end of quotation. What substantially emerges in the text of 2 Maccabees is a discursive Greek-centered reinvention of Judaism, according to which there is not the slightest shred of evidence for religion and politics as separate spheres in ancient Judea. Boyarin's interpretation of 2 Maccabees seems to explain the usage of Judaismos in the Pauline epistles as well, especially Galatians 1:13-14, or 1 Corinthians 1:20-24, and so on. When in Galatians 1:13-14, Paul says formerly he was very advanced in Judaismos, he is surely not referring to an abstract category or an institution, but the practicing of Jewish ways of loyalty to the traditional practices of Jews, the same form of life described by his contemporary Josephus as, I quote, the ancestral traditions of the Judaioi, Antiquities 20:41. Moreover, Paul, in spite of the discursive dimension that is implicit in his usage of words like Hellenismos and or Judaismos, refers to the doing, especially the zealous conduct, of a life committed to keeping the mitzvot or commandments. This designated as Judaizing in much the same way that writing Greek properly may be designated as Hellenizing. However, the case of Josephus' writings appears even more indicative. The historian's preference for the term nomos as a kind of keyword for identifying various Jewish forms of life, for example, in Against Apion 2:145, shows, as Daniels underlines, I quote, a way far more expensive than our notion of law would predict. End of quotation. For Josephus, nomos incorporates civil and criminal law, the organization of government, plus cultic practice including temple and private observance, and also beliefs about Yahweh. His assembling all of these elements does demonstrate the insufficiency of an improper and or modern separation of such categories in describing a specific Jewish representation of the world. Boyarin states also that Josephus uses various lexical items to describe the Judean way of life, recognizing it as a whole systemic entity. Yet, Josephus avoids defining such a complex unity with the known Judaism. How does Josephus interpret, if indeed he does, the Judean form of life? Boyarin emphasizes that for our historian, Judeans, I quote, do not have a unique way of referring to themselves that marks them off from all the other species of peoples in the world as a genus unto themselves. End of quotation. According to Josephus, Judeans have regarded themselves as one of the family of nations. More precisely, and following Mason's interpretation about this, Boyarin recognized that, I quote, there won't be any Judaism or any word for it in a Jewish language for many centuries. End of quotation. In the following section of the book, Boyarin analyzes, among other questions, the term Yahadut, as we found it in some medieval sources. This seems at first glance an abstract noun, rudely parallel with modern Judaism, but Boyarin's analysis stands, as always, like a corrosive antidote to similar automatisms. The results of Boyarin's terminological analysis suggest two sets of usage that sometimes overlap. In juridical context, Yahadut alludes to the status of being a Jew, of being a member of Israel as a juridical entity. If the origins of this usage are not clear, it is attested fairly early in medieval rabbinic sources, first of all as the designation of the purpose of an immersion in the mikvah. For example, see the very late Midrash Sekel Tov, or as the indication for the status of Jewry itself, so that Abram was Abraham's name in Goyut, and Abram is Yahadut, as we read in the anthology of commentaries on the Torah from the Tosafists of 12th to 14th century, Rhineland and northern France. The second set of usages is found especially in homiletic rabbinic contexts. There, Yahadut is used generically to allude to a practiced commitment to worship Yahweh and loyalty to the founding practices of the Jews, to the Torah. Not, therefore, much different from the Judaïsmos that Boyarin has explored in the preceding section of his book. Boyarin concludes that in none of the current texts, I quote, does Yahadut ever refer to an abstraction on the order of Jewish religion or even Jewish cultures as it does today. End of quotation. If in the 15th century Boyarin continues to find significant use of Yahadut that follow and develop its earlier significance, in the beginnings of the early modern period, he glimpses indications that other usage of the word are developing more or less clearly. An important role in such a terminological conceptual shift, according to Boyarin, was presumably played by the quotation of what is almost surely a corruption in Rashi's commentary to Sanhedrin 74b. Concerning the last aspect, anyway, Boyarin underlines that toward the end of the early modern period in Jewish culture appear, I quote, further indications that some traditionalist Jewish intellectuals are beginning to utilize the distinction religious-secular in a fashion not entirely unlike their Christian and Western European contemporaries. End of quotation. The last section of the book follows the story of the formation of the idea word Judaism. I quote, ne, Christian, Latin, Judaismus in the Ecclesia, and its very belated entry into Jewish parlance, thus precipitating the existence of modern Judaism in all its variety. End of quotation. Boyarin embraced the thesis that Judaism as an abstraction in antiquity is, I quote, a Christian term of art invented initially for purposes of the formation of Christian orthodoxy, end of quotation, and or theology, I add. Here the question of religion is paramount, and Boyarin takes us back to his earlier essay entitled Semantic Differences or Judaism Christianity. In this essay, and with some variances in his book, Boyarin argues that the stable category of religion was invented by Christians to distinguish themselves from the various other ancient practices in their midst. Basically, Boyarin looks at religion as a Christian discursive invention. And if Judaism, as we know it, is a religion, then Christianity proceeded to invent it through a very stratified and complex discursive process. And here I want to recall another very important book in such a way, David Nirenberg's book on Judaism, that is very, very important about this. It is important to stress here that such a discursive march was pursued also in the following periods, often by transposing and modifying theological discourses in the scientific consideration about religion and or religions. What Koku von Stuckrad has labeled as the sanctification of religion has favored the process by which Jews have appropriated a theological Christian invention as an instrument of self-definition. In the last section of this book, Boyarin starts from the presence of Judaism in the Theodosian Code, but from this he takes some steps further back in history in order to show the discursive roots of that theological legal iceberg we found in the late antique Codex. Boyarin analyzes the usage of Judaismos in Ignatius of Antioch's epistles, 2nd century, in Epiphanius and Jerome's writings, 4th, 5th century, as well as in other Latin theologians of late antique Christianity, going far beyond David Nirenberg's approach, according to which anti-Judaism was an hermeneutical gesture carried out by Christian theologians as regards a kind of anti-version of themselves. For Boyarin, there are no differences between Judaism and anti-Judaism, as Judaism itself is an anti-category. It stands always as the wrong religion that highlights a Christian worldview. Boyarin follows such a posture not only in the obvious polemical context of the Middle Ages, but already in the discursive production of the late antique church fathers, as well as in their relative Jewish incorporations according to the westernization that is implicit in the cultural program of the so-called Wissenschaft des Judentums. If that of Judaism, as Daniel underlines in this book, is a discursive invention, more specifically a Christian invention, it follows that it is involved in a complex network of various collateral communicative acts. What I mean is that every discursive creation is not isolated, but lives and interacts with other components that support it. This clearly emerges from an early Christian text that is not covered by Daniel's analysis, but in my view, it is very interesting and very illuminating also to shed light on collateral aspects of this communicative machine. Countering actions depicted as expressions of a particular Jewish form of life, the author of the book of Revelation of John, at the end of the 1st century, provides his answer. It is not possible to believe in Jesus and at the same time to implement forms of cultic mixture. In this discursive framework, I explain also John's attacks against forms of competing cultic leaderships. Among these, the refusal of meats sacrificed to idols, Revelation 2, 6, 14, 15, 20, and the polemics against female forms of visionary authority, 2, 20, 23, appear both expressions of a corruption of what John, the seer of Patmos, the author of Revelation, considers as the true cultic practices. The so-called Balaamites do not see feeding on meat sacrificed to the idols as a problem, and this tolerance pushes the seer of Patmos to accuse them of prostitution, 2:14. The prophetess Jezebel also seems to support a similar tendency, 2:20, and she is accused of fornication with the same association that we find in the 2:14. Balaamites are considered close to Nicolaites, 2:25, and here we have a further reference to the Ecclesia of Ephesus, 2:6, for its hatred towards the works of Nicolaites, which I also despise, quotation in the text. In this framework, the stigmatization against those who, I quote, say they are Jews and are not, but are the synagogue of Satan, 2:9, emerges as an explicit reference to those who claim their Jewish origin despite their refusal of the faith in Jesus as it is proclaimed by John. As a whole, the author of Revelation claims for himself a conservative cultic identity or a cultic identity actually reinvented as a conservative. That is contrary to any form of dialogue with surrounding hegemonic cultic backgrounds. But such an explicit refusal does not immediately mean that the seer is not sensitive as regards a Jewish self-definition as an instrument of orientation in a particular world. It remains over the discursive polemical attacks, but somehow it justifies and informs them. A very similar case, although on a different discursive plan, is that of Ignatius of Antioch, as clearly emerged especially for Boyarin's reconstruction. But I want also to quote a very recent article on this problem by Emanuele Castelli in Revue des Etudes Augustiniens. Writing of Ignatius' letters, Boyarin suggests that, I quote, Judaismos no longer means observance of the law as it did in Paul, but a broader sense of Jewish doings, including verbal ones. In other words, for him, for Ignatius, Christianismos and Judaismos are two doxas, I think in Bourdieu's approach also. Two theological positions, a wrong one and a right one, a wrong interpretation of the legacy of the prophets and a right one. If, end of quotation, if, as Boyarin does, it is correct to emphasize the fact that Judaismos in Ignatius does not seem to mean what it means in other Christian theologians of and before his time, namely the false views and misguided practice, or insisting especially on the ritual requirements of that system, as it emerges also but not only in the relation of John, it follows that the discursive creation of Judaism is located at the core of a very stratified network of other correlated discursive components, at the base of which we find an implicit consideration concerning what Judaism really means in opposition to its deviation, or to what is represented as a false definition of Judaism itself. In summary, we can say that since Judaism helps Christianity self-identify as the truth and thus as a religion, it follows that Christianity simply becomes a true Judaism in opposition to what is discursively constructed as a false Judaism. Ignatius is really emblematic about this, and I could recall many examples from Ignatius' letters, but I have no time. I want to conclude. Polemics regarding concept of Judaism and or Christianity, or the true membership or the true appartenance to a specific group or to a specific movement and so on, especially in antiquity, but not only, involve struggles both for leadership within specific fields and for dominance across fields, with the realm of public or parapublic communication representing a shared competitive arena. Communicative competition, however, requires some degree of public involvement, creating a variety of opportunities for those individuals which are outside of the traditional elite realm to structure partially the actions or behaviors of both the same elites and the dominated. Such opportunities take the form of mechanisms of constraint. New discourses or new declinations of previous self-defining discourses within networked communication, like that devised by, for example, Ignatius or Paul before, in this sense suggest an increased capacity of individuals outside the traditional communicative elites of the Roman Empire to participate in the symbolic production of group identities in a partially mutated world, and thus to exercise their capacity for social constraint in a more individual manner. And I think that Daniel's book, especially for the study of ancient world and ancient self-definition, is very, very instructive about this. Thank you very much.
Schalfu tzarim charbam libam, chafu dvarim lochen bekirbam, shadedu arim evion bribam, kiresam tifkana, honenu yetarim lachtot mrivam, vestafu chaverim afar borbam, umipaz yekarim dakrub charbam, chatetzam lelibam tfalachna, umamot halkubiem, Al mu bezadon ispatta